Good morning. My name is Jim Dandy O'Kelly. I'm just going to title this CD that I made in 2011, Thomas M. Rivers, M.D., the bad guy. Rivers was a head in charge of the virus research department for the Rockefeller people. And in 1938, Basil O'Connor brought him into the National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis. And then the fraud began. So I'm just going to turn this on. It's 42 minutes, so make sure you get time to listen to it because these are all pieces of the puzzle. I have accused Thomas Rivers of the Rockefeller Foundation of being the bad guy. The man who, knowing the entire history of the virus research hunters, starting with Martinez Bejernek, this man took the germ theory guidelines and applied them to a virus that he knew was not alive. He is responsible, among others, but primarily him, for miseducating the entire medical profession, which now has the entire world miseducated as to the truth that there is no such thing as a living virus. I have in my hands a book called Viral Infections of Man, edited by Thomas Rivers. It was written in 1948. In the preface, Thomas Rivers says, "There is a need for a book on viral infections of man to which medical students and practicing physicians may turn for information." He says, "Within the past few years, there have been considerable stabilization of knowledge and ideas, and it is now time that there be brought together in such a way that interested people not actively engaged in the study of viral infections may have easy access to them." He says, "To publish a book of this nature costs a great deal, and without subsidy it would be available to only a limited number of people. The National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis has provided financial aid for the preparation and the publication of the volume so that its price should not be a factor limiting the number of people who read it." Signed, Thomas Rivers. Now you know what this means. Basil O'Connor was the president of the National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis. They're the ones who conducted the 1954 field trial. Thomas Rivers joined the National Foundation, I think it was in 1938. Thomas Rivers was the chief virologist for the Rockefeller Foundation. He's the man who controlled everything. And now in 1948, he's writing a book to miseducate, mislead, and to lie to the entire medical profession. And this is how he does it. I'm going to take a few sentences out of each chapter and give you the dates, names, facts, and places, and you will easily see with your prior knowledge of my audios 1 and 2 on the origin of the living virus, lie, you will see exactly how he did it. Now, in chapter 1, Rivers himself opens up, and he says, in 1898, the filterable virus era was vigorously initiated by the rediscovery that tobacco mosaic is caused by an agent capable of passing through earthenware filters impervious to ordinary bacteria. Now, you know that isn't what happened. You know that Martinez Bejernek, when he injected his sap into those plants, concluded and assumed that there was a living agent in the sap that infected the plant rather than him just poisoning the plant. Rivers knew that, but he isn't telling these people the truth. He is totally misleading them. Then Rivers says, no virus has been cultivated or induced to increase in amount in the absence of living susceptible cells. Whatever the nature of reproduction of viruses may be, it is now generally believed that it goes on within infected cells. End of quote. You know that that belief came from Martinez Bejernek, and so did he. The interesting thing here is where he says, no virus has been cultivated or induced to increase. Increase virus, increase poison. That makes a lot more sense than multiplication, doesn't it? And I think that's where the real trick or gimmick is, that they put this poison into an agar or some other substance that causes an increase in substance, and they just say, well, that's the virus multiplying. Rivers then says, since it is now generally believed that all viruses multiply or are reduplicated within susceptible cells instead of in the fluid surrounding them. Well, generally believed, there were no facts, there were no proof, and with the information you have, you now know that that belief is totally erroneous and basically a lie. Again, notice they use the word susceptible cells. So in other words, even if your virus were a living agent, which we know it isn't, it couldn't do any good unless the cell was susceptible. And if that's the case, then the virus itself, like a bacteria, could not be the cause of the problem. Otherwise, the cell wouldn't have to be susceptible. No matter how strong it was, the all-powerful germ or so-called living virus would do its damage and attack and cause disease. This is why they use the word susceptible, because what they're really saying, if we inject poison in something and it gets sick, it was susceptible. And if it didn't get sick, it wasn't susceptible. The word really doesn't mean anything at all. It's just kind of a cop-out for them. He says it is often impossible, because of the complexity of tissues involved, to ascertain the nature of primary changes induced by the activity of viruses. He again knows that there is no activity of a virus. He knows it's not alive. He knows they couldn't see anything. He's just saying these things so that these people who are just believers themselves, the ones who read this, will get the wrong impression of what a virus really is. Here's a statement that tells you just how backwards and ignorant the medical profession is. Rivers says it is well known that excellent health is no protection against measles, influenza, chickenpox, and smallpox. Furthermore, it is a definite impression of many people working with viruses that unhealthy animals are either more resistant or react less severely to certain viral maladies than do perfectly normal animals. Well, why should anybody eat right? Why should anybody exercise? Why should anybody do anything? I mean, if you get sicker and weaker, you're going to be more resistant. This is why the medical profession doesn't make any sense. He says, it is not known why permanent immunity is not developed to common colds, influenza, and certain other viral diseases. Here, he's sitting there telling everybody that viruses cause these diseases, and the only virus he ever knew was a poison from a plant sap, or from the spinal cord of that boy who died of polio, and they cut it up and injected it into the brain of the monkey. Rivers was a mastermind of deception. Check this out. The way by which viruses are disseminated in a population varies. Some diseases, like smallpox, chickenpox, measles, are extremely contagious and are spread by contact or by droplet nuclei in the air. Now, you believe that this guy is sitting there telling people that all these things are caused by viruses and it comes from the air and it comes from contact, and he's never seen anything, never had any proof, and these people just believed? And now in chapter 2, we're going to hear from W.M. Stanley. He's the guy that, he worked for Rockefeller, of course, and he purified the tobacco mosaic leaf virus in 1935. And here's what he's saying in 1948. Viruses were discovered by means of a physical technique, namely filtration, and since 1892, when Ivanovsky reported the results of his filtration experiments with the agent responsible for the tobacco mosaic disease, physical and chemical techniques have played an increasingly important role in studies on viruses. The filtration experiments were repeated independently by Bejernik in 1898. Here he is telling you the beginning of the virus thing, and yet they're going to go on and say that this is the cause of human disease. This had nothing to do with human disease. The plants themselves did not inject anything into themselves to get discolored or mottled. It wasn't really a disease, as you well know by now. So when Stanley says, for example, Bejernik also showed that the causative agent of the disease we know that he didn't show anything. The only causing agent he had was the poison he injected, and that had nothing to do with a human being getting a disease or getting sick. And here they tell you about the centrifuge. A physical method of purification involving high-speed centrifugation in a vacuum-type angle centrifuge has come into prominence. Many of the objectives formerly accomplished by filtration are now accomplished by means of high-speed centrifugation. And there you have it. They're telling you that this machine is essential to their virus poison. Here it is in Stanley's own words. The starting material is first centrifuged at a speed and for a length of time sufficient to sediment practically all materials which migrate more rapidly than the length of time necessary to sediment all or most of the virus. The supernatant liquid is discarded, and the pellets of virus, which are usually small, are suspended in a liquid known to provide a favorable environment. The virus preparation is then subjected to another cycle of differential centrifugation, and this is repeated until tests indicate that practically all light and heavy impurities have been removed. Now you notice the first sentence he said was the starting material. Didn't tell you what it is, but you know what it is. It's monkey brain, it's spinal cord, it's rabbit testicles, it's any sick, perverted idea that these people could come up with. And here you are with your influenza virus. Stanley says, thus in the case of influenza virus, absorption of virus on washed chicken red blood cells provides a means of fractionation. So what are they telling you? What's the virus? It's nasal discharge. They just leave these little things out. Kind of deceitful, isn't it? How would you think this borders on the line of just trickery or perhaps fraud? Stanley says, the oldest physical procedure employed in the study of viruses is filtration. That's your filterable virus from Martinez-Bazurnek. And here Stanley brings up the electron microscope. He says electron micrographs show conclusively that influenza virus is essentially spherical. Didn't tell you what that virus was made out of or what the source was, did he? The nasal discharge. The good old snot shot. And here Stanley admits, one of the most useful physical tools that can be brought to bear upon the study of viruses is the electron microscope. You know, Stanley may have been used in this book. He may not have been a part of this deception, because here he says, since electrons cannot penetrate air, the whole electron path must be in a vacuum. Devices must be available for introducing the photographic plate and also the object into the system from which air has been removed. This imposes a limitation on the usefulness of the electron microscope, for it is very difficult to obtain images of anything other than thoroughly dried material. And he knew dried material was not alive. So he may have been just giving the experiment of what he's doing for whatever reason, and Rivers threw him in there to gain support for this massive deception that Rivers is trying to do. Here there are a lot of real pictures of the viruses being the ground up tobacco leaf. You know, you look at them and you see all these little dots and you see these little lines in there, and you see where it says it was magnified 21,000 times. And you know you put a dead leaf in there that was decomposed and you ground it up, and you know you centrifuged it, and you know you put it under this microscope to see it. How in the world could anyone say that's the cause of disease? That is the product of a disease. That is the end result. That is the decomposition. It didn't cause itself. These people couldn't have been that, well, they couldn't have been that stupid. They just couldn't have been. They had to have known. This whole thing is as phony as the day is long. Here's another rare moment of truth. Chapter 3, we have a Joseph Smedell talking about some virus infections. And he says, most of the basic techniques have been borrowed directly from bacteriology. And we're talking about viruses. They've taken the bacteria germ theory as a guideline or a framework in order to apply this bacteria. Sorry about that. You may have picked up that telephone call I had a minute ago. But here in, again, Chapter 3, serologic methods provide the trellis which supports the rapidly spreading growth of knowledge of viral agents. Most of the basic techniques have been borrowed directly from bacteriology. And there you are. Rivers just stole those ideas and he passed them off as being truthful and the way that the application to viruses are. And it's just viruses and bacteria are obviously totally two different things. As bacteria are alive, viruses are dead poison coming from dead animals. But here again, Chapter 3, they tell you what it is. Virus, 10 or more brains removed from mice showing nervous signs are ground with sand or alundum, and 10 cc's of inactivated, undiluted rabbit serum are added for each gram of brain tissue. After centrifugation, at about 2000 RPM for 10 minutes, the supernatant fluid is drawn off and regarded as the 1 to 10 dilution of virus. There you are. I mean, this is the secret that they don't want anybody to know about. And here he says the finding of a neutralizing antibody against a virus in a single specimen of serum usually cannot be regarded as proof that the recent illness of a patient was caused by the virus in question. You know what? Do antibodies really exist also? We know viruses don't. I'm beginning to wonder about that too. There may be some cells in there that do some house cleaning, but this so-called antibody thing, I think, is just another part of the trickery. Chapter 4, E.W. Goodpasture says the living cells of the extra embryonic membranes and tissue organs and yolk sac of the developing chick embryo provide the environmental factors required for multiplication of most of the viruses. Now, you know, another thing that's the common sense is telling me the living cells of the organs and tissues, that's what's alive. That's not any virus, because the virus is a poison they're putting in there. We know that's not alive. So the only thing living is cells. So when they mix those poisons and cells up, somehow there must be an increase. And they use a little trickery and say, well, that's a multiplication. You got to pay attention to a lot of these words and definitions. It says it is essential that the inoculum be bacteriologically sterile. A few bacteria of low virulence, which accidentally gain entrance during inoculation, usually do not thrive in the embryo and rarely constitute a source of error. Well, if they're killing the bacteria, what are they referring to when they say live virus? See, there's a gimmick there somewhere. There's a little con game going on somewhere. And eventually, this stuff's going to come out too. This chapter, they're actually showing you with pictures how they take the eggs and cut holes in them and inject it with their so-called virus poison and the whole thing, you know, just step by step. It's really incredible that anybody ever thought of this kind of sick stuff in the first place. Now you want to know why they use the chickens. It says because of their greater availability, chicken embryos have been almost exclusively used for the propagation of viruses. Oh, okay, so they could use other stuff. They just happen to use the chicken because they got more chickens than they got ducks, I guess. Who knows? And here's chapter 5 with our old buddy John Enders, who said he grew the virus in 1949 and was also given the credit for the measles vaccine in 1961. Let's see what he's got to say. Here he says, it's apparent to most observers that viruses, unlike bacteria, fail to multiply when inoculated into lifeless media. Do you think that's because everything in that little culture disc is lifeless, so nothing can multiply? And then, like I just read before, when they stick the junk in cells that are living, the cells are actually multiplying, and this is their little secret they don't want you to know? Here's an example of how demented they are. They're talking about an experiment, and it says, These investigators carried vaccinia virus, that's cowpox pus by the way, through a series of 11 cultures of rabbit testicles tissue and found that the last contained 51,000 times as much virus. So they're taking this poison and putting it into the testicles of rabbits, and something multiplies, and they claim it's a living agent that causes human disease. I hope you're getting this picture by now of this tremendous fraud that's been perpetrated on the American people. I'm sorry, the whole world. Now this may be closer to the truth. Inoculation is accomplished most easily by incorporating the infective material in the nutrient fluid. By titrating specimens of nutrient fluid removed at intervals, it is possible to obtain estimates of the rate of increase of a virus and its persistence in a culture. Notice the key point, infective material, which if it was influenza would be nasal discharge. And then it goes on to say increase of virus. I think that's the real word there. Increase is not multiplication, just an increase, more abundance of whatever this poison is that they're playing in their little Mickey Mouse games with. Here's in chapter 6, a fellow by the name of Kenneth Maxey. He says that as a result of centuries of host wanderings, mutation and selective adaptation, the viruses considered in this book have in some degree become established in the biologic orbit of man and are responsible for some of his ills. So he's just taking another shot to ingrain the fact that he's trying to say the viruses cause human disease. Here in chapter 7, by a fellow named A.D. Hershey, talking about bacterial viruses, says, since the introduction by Ellis and Delbruck in 1939, the growth of bacterial viruses has been studied almost exclusively by the one-step growth experiment. This consists of mixing suitable amounts of bacteria and virus under conditions which allow a known number of growing cells to become infected with a known number of viral particles. You know, you got to tear this thing apart, folks. They're talking about growing, and what they're talking about. Sorry about that, another little phone call. They're saying they're mixing bacteria and virus into growing cells. Now, you know the virus is poison, so the only question is what poison are they mixing, and what does any of that have to do with a human being getting sick? Now, here in chapter 8, we got another Rockefeller guy, Peter Olitsky, who says there are degrees of neurotropism, so that a distinction is made between highly neurotropic viruses, such as those of poliomyelitis and rabies. Now you notice he just implanted the idea that viruses cause both polio and rabies. Now we always thought it was bacteria that caused rabies. Remember, that was past year. Here again he uses the word increase. He says, finally it has been reported that there is a marked difference in the increase of the virus in the brain tissue of susceptible and resistant mice. Now here's an interesting statement because he says, immunization by means of a vaccine devised by Sabin, 1943, which consists of formalin inactivated virus, has not yet had an adequate trial in human beings. Well, we know what they're working for, and that's Rivers' goal. But notice he said inactivated virus. I thought Sabin was the live virus man. Did somebody switch their horse in the middle of a stream somewhere along the way here? Here we go. Here's one by Harold Johnson, M.D., another Rockefeller man, talking about rabies. First sentence, rabies is an acute infection of the central nervous system caused by a virus. This is what they're doing. They're supporting, corroborating the fact that this virus causes human disease. Every one of these chapters is going to give you the same story over and over again. Here we go again. Since the infective agent, as obtained from brains of diseased animals, could not be identified with certainty by microscopic examination and could not be cultivated in media used for the growth of ordinary bacteria, it was called a virus, from the Latin word for poison. And there is, in your face, truth. See if you ever read this in your high school or college books. Patients receiving rabies vaccine treatment may develop paralysis attributable to a sensitization, being sensitive, caused by the rabbit brain material in the vaccine. So let's see. You go and get a vaccine because a dog bit you, which isn't going to give you rabies anyway, and you get paralyzed, so now they're going to tell you that you were attacked by a polio virus. I'm just going to bring this one point up and make a point on it. He says the inclusion bodies, which can be demonstrated in the neurons of the majority of cases of rabies, generally are referred to as Nigri bodies. Inclusion bodies, there's a whole lot of scientists out there that said virus particles were inclusion bodies. In other words, they were included in part of the cell. That's why it's a particle. You break open a cell, it's going to be broken up into particles. These people are the morons that are calling that the living agent that causes a disease because they inject it into other animals or plants. And in summary, he says, it may be said that the natural or so-called street virus rabies is characterized. They never saw any natural or street virus rabies. They never saw any natural virus anywhere. The only virus they've ever seen is the poison they make up in their laboratory. This is the lie. And here again, talking about rabies virus, it says, by the original method, graded amounts of active virus were obtained by drying infected rabbit spinal cords for varying periods of time in a jar containing sticks of potassium hydroxide. Here, this is some appetizing. There are only a few laboratories outside of France and the French colonies that continue to prepare vaccines from desiccated spinal cords. It has been found that rabbit brain is a much better source of fixed virus than is the spinal cord. Take your choice. You know, you should know by now what they're doing. They're killing these animals, their infections, and they're saying that the product of disease caused disease, that the product of disease prevents disease. These people are nuts. Here in chapter 10, we go to another one of the great deceivers, Howard A. Howe, Poliomyelitis Research Center, Johns Hopkins. He was also involved in getting funded by the National Foundation and the Rockefellers. They were all in the same bed together. Let's see what he has to say. Here we go with the statements that led to the great Salk vaccine massacre in 1955 of those 210 kids. Howard Howe says, Landsteiner and Popper, 1909, succeeded in producing a febrile illness characterized by flaccid paralysis in a monkey by the injection of an emulsion of the spinal cord from a fatal case of poliomyelitis. He didn't say, you know, you read that and you think, well, he stuck the stuff in his arm, which would be bad enough. Anyway, he didn't say that they cut the monkey's head open and injected this stuff directly into its brain. And I don't know that much about the science end of it, but I know the spinal cord and the brain cord control the muscles. If you stick poison in those things and you kill those or paralyze those nerves, you're not going to be able to walk or move your arms or whatever. This stuff just gets totally ridiculous. These scientists couldn't be that stupid. They all got to be in this together. How's this for a diagnosis? He says the surest means of diagnosis, however, is the isolation of virus from the stools or nasal secretions of the patient. So they're just simply taking feces and snot and putting this stuff in a centrifuge machine and separating the solid from the liquid and saying that's the cause of the disease. They couldn't be any more dumber. Talk about dumb and dumber, boy, that's as dumb as you can get. And to end it, it says control measures known cases of poliomyelitis should be isolated either at home or in a hospital for a period of 3 weeks from the date of onset. You know, polio, according to the books I've read, was basically a one-family disease. and was very rare. There were a couple of occasions where they claimed that two people had it in the same family. But here they're isolating it, saying, go back home, get in there with your 3 brothers and 4 sisters, your mother and your father, and don't worry about giving it to them. Here in chapter 11 by Paul Havens Jr. and John Paul. John Paul was also part of the Rockefeller team. About infectious hepatitis. There are probably several forms of viral infections of the liver, which are variants of one general group. You know, when you read this stuff, folks, you've got to read it precisely. There are probably. The word probably means they don't know. But then for not knowing anything, they go down at the bottom of the page and he says, infectious hepatitis is a subacute viral infection. Before it was probably, now it is. This is why everybody's so confused, because people just assume these guys know what they're talking about and they don't try to think about it this closely. And this is the real experiments that viruses are based upon, not that mumbo jumbo that a lot of people are getting today from the CDC. Here he says, the modern concept of the viral etiology of infectious hepatitis is a product of investigations attendant upon World War II. Voigt was the first to report its transmission to human volunteers by feeding them duodenal contents from a patient with the malady. Now that's somewhere, some part of the organ down there. I'm not that familiar with the part of organs, but I know it's a part of an organ. And they're taking the contents of this stuff, which is decomposed, rotting material, and feeding them to volunteers. What the hell has that got to do with you and me getting a cold? Actually feeding that stuff to anybody would make anybody sick, wouldn't it? They just perpetuated disease after disease. Here's more isolation. The virus is readily recovered from the blood and feces of patients. Here's a little more truth you don't get. During World War II, tens of thousands of cases of serum hepatitis occurred. Most of these were in military personnel following transfusions of plasma or vaccination with the yellow fever vaccine, which contained human serum. Yeah, they wiped out yellow fever too, right? And here comes the guesswork again. As in infectious hepatitis, the etiologic agent of serum hepatitis is believed to be a virus and is transmissible to man in a series and evokes a like immunity. Yeah, right. Here's chapter 12 by a Frank Horsfall. This guy, I think, was like the vice president of the Rockefeller Institute. He's talking about the common cold, and he says the etiology has not been conclusively established, although there is evidence suggesting that some colds may be initiated by a virus. See, this is where they're beginning to switch from the bacteria to the viruses. On their etiology, it says many workers think that the common cold is often initiated by a virus. We're not talking about workers, by the way, they're talking about the virologists as workers. The results of numerous transmission experiments with bacteria-free filtrates in man and anthropoid apes support this idea. So you know what they're doing now, don't you? They're simply taking the virus, the nasal discharge, and injecting this stuff into these man and apes. And this is their experiment. This is what they're doing to try to determine the cause of the cold. The cause of the cold is simple to any thinking person. And he says, these agents are known to harbor one or more latent viruses, which in a number of instances are themselves capable of inducing pneumonia in their natural host. Here we have chapter 14 again by Frank Horsfall. I could say another name, but I won't. Influenza is an acute self-limited infectious disease of man which is caused by a virus of the influenza group. He says it just like it's absolutely God's word, the absolute truth. These people, I don't know how they live with themselves, I'm telling you. Here he's talking about the flu virus. He says it's an infection agent. And he says our old buddy Francis in 1940 independently recovered the influenza B virus from the throat washings of patients. You got it? They're taking nasal discharge from sick people. Interesting point here, he says numerous other infectious diseases may closely simulate influenza and should be distinguished from it. You know, when you get to reading medical science and you go back into the books, these are conditions. They're not specific diseases. Sorry about that. Little dog started barking. Someone was at the door. I'll get through this. Anyway, it says vaccinated persons can and do contract influenza. There you are. Chapter 15, smallpox and vaccinia. Here again, they press the point, first paragraph. Smallpox and vaccinia are caused by two closely related but distinct viruses. And here on chapter 17 by Phillips Dyson, M.D., about trachoma and inclusion conjunctivitis are closely related virus infections of the external eye. Here in chapter 18 on measles, they give an example here that should certainly prove to anyone that a germ is not the cause of disease. They're talking about measles, and it says Home is the name of somebody, in 1758 reported attempts at transmission of the disease by placing cotton soaked with fresh blood from patients in the acute phase of the disease in incisions in the skin of individuals with no previous history. Measles apparently resulted within 7 days in 7 of the 15 volunteers. So first of all, 7 from 15 is 8 who didn't get it. Second of all, it says apparently resulted. So what are we telling you? We've got another story here where somebody thought this, somebody thought that. A few spots here, some poison infections there because of what they put this blood-soaked incisions into their skin. I mean, nobody got measles that way. Nobody got sick that way. This whole thing is just ridiculous. Here's another example of your great science in chapter 19 on rubella. The disease has been transmitted to children by the inoculation of filtered nasal washings. This one on chapter 21, I'll just read the title of the book. I don't even have to give you any quotes from the book itself. It's just repetition. Diseases caused by the virus of herpes simplex. That's it. They don't say they think or it's possible or it's hypothetical. They're just saying that it is, even though they've never seen anything, and they admit that. They haven't got a clue to what they're talking about. And this one in chapter 22 is our old buddy Thomas Rivers again. I'm not sure I'm going to pronounce this right, but we'll take a shot at it. Epidemic keratoconjunctivitis. Oh, that sounds horrible, doesn't it? Here's Rivers, caused by a virus similar to that producing herpes simplex. Here, chapter 23, varicella herpes zoster group. It is caused by a virus similar to that which induces herpes zoster. In the picture here, this is a setup. This whole book is designed and set up to miseducate anyone who read it, whether they're a doctor, whether they're not. Here we go back to chapter 24 with our old friend John Enders again, who said he grew the virus, talking about mumps. He says, but it was not until 1934 that the causative agent was definitely proved to be a filterable virus. And he quotes Johnson and Goodpasture. So they're saying a filterable virus, which you now know is some disease product run through a filter, is the cause of mumps. It's mind-blowing, isn't it? Here in chapter 25 is Thomas Rivers again, talking about infectious mononucleosis. Here he has to try to change pace a little bit, and he says the etiology is not definitely known, although a virus is suspected. See, every chapter, every one of these scientists, every one of these people are just repeating over and over again to plant the idea in the people's brain that this so-called virus is the cause of all these diseases. Here in chapter 27 is another one of the deceivers, Harold Cox, worked for the Literal Laboratories, talking about the Colorado tick fever. Colorado tick fever is caused by a tick-borne virus. That'll be interesting, as small as a tick is. You're going to cut one of those guys open and get the decomposed insides of a tick. Here we are with Max Tyler, chapter 28, yellow fever. Yellow fever in man is an acute infection caused by a virus. Here is our friend Max Tyler again, chapter 29, Rift Valley fever. Rift Valley fever is an acute disease of sheep and other lower animals and is caused by a specific virus. Chapter 30 by our friend Albert Sabin, the other polio fraudulent person who was given credit for the sugar pill back in 1960, talking about a Dengue, I think it's Dengue, fever. Dengue is an infectious mosquito-transmitted disease of virus etiology. Here's chapter 31 by Albert Sabin again, talking about, and I'll try to pronounce this, phlebotomous fever. Phlebotomous fever is a self-limited, non-fatal illness of virus etiology. Well, I think you get the picture. Anyone reading that book is going to walk away with the thought that some mysterious virus that nobody ever saw is the cause of all these diseases, and they're going to lead these people to go out and miseducate everyone else. I mean, this is a book, this is the Bible of the virus deception. You got to remember that these Rockefeller people, all these people were giving these same BS stories to the magazines, leading magazines of the country like Time and Look and Life, and Parents and everything else. Just like in my other audio, I gave you the examples of that. And it goes on for what, 100 years now? That this idea of a virus is a living thing that causes human disease, and you now know, or should know by now, it is absolute, total bullshit. Pardon my French. All right, thanks for listening. I think I'm going to go to bed now. There you have another piece of the puzzle. There are many pieces to this puzzle, believe me. So more to come. This is Jim Dandy O'Kelly signing off.